Good afternoon. Thank you, Anila, for that warm introduction, and it's both a pleasure as well as an honor. Yeah, it's good. Yeah, to be here at Tse Chen Ling. I very rarely actually give talks at Dharma centers. Probably you notice that's one thing that I've always kind of avoided. Because I thought there are so many teachers, and my strength really lies more in bringing Buddhist ideas and insights into the secular domain and interfacing with science and philosophy, which not many geshes and lamas can do, which I thought is probably better placed for me. But also there's one advantage of being in that world is that there is less projection on me as a teacher, which is kind of freer. And also being a lay person, I like to be down with the people and, be part of the crowd, as it were. Even when I was a monk, being a Dharma teacher, I never felt comfortable. So maybe, my karma isn't there. But this is a special one because this year, being 2019, being 600th anniversary of Je Tsongkhapa's nirvana, is a very important year for the Tibetans in general, and particularly for those of us who are members of the Gelug tradition. And I myself had the good fortune to study at Ganden Monastery. So when Steve, where is Steve, by the way? He's ill. Oh, he's ill. Yes. So sorry to hear that. Yeah. So when Steve approached me, I said, I come through Bay Area fairly often because of my work for Compassion Institute in Stanford. I would love to come to the center, and I've just finished this book on a modern biography of Je Rinpoche. So giving a talk on Je Rinpoche would be quite easy for me. I wouldn't have to prepare, and it's something that it's quite fresh in my mind. And so I said, I would love to do this, and this is hopefully going to be one of the few things that I will do this year. In the middle of May, I'm going to Louisville, Kentucky. There's a Dharma center there, Gomang Center. I said I'll do something similar to honor the 600th anniversary of Tsongkhapa's nirvana. I'll speak more about his life, but also what inspired me. The reason why I chose to do this biography, and those who read Tibetan will know that there are many, many biographies of Tsongkhapa. He's he's one single historical figure about whom there has been a huge amount of biographical writing. Over 40 biographies have been written about him. 4 of them are book length. One of them is very early by Kyodro Rinpoche, Tsongkhapa's own student, which really formed the basis and established the chronology of the various events in his life. So from a Tibetan point of view, in fact, some of my Geshe friends were saying, why do we need one? They said, we have them, which is true. But the one thing that I said was, but most of these biographies are written as a hagiography. They are kind of written by devout students honoring and celebrating the Lama's life. And in the Tibetan tradition, even the Tibetan word namtar, which means liberating, life, already says what the purpose of those biographies are. Those biographies are not written in a way that we would understand in modern English what biography is. They are not meant to be, honest, frank portrayal of the character and the person of that individual that you're writing about. They are really written for devout students and believers to really inspire and continue to give a model of how to live and how to practice, which is perfectly fine. But as a biography, it doesn't work. So I said, in any case, I'm writing it in English, so that your arguments don't apply to me. I said I'm writing it for the modern reader, and the thing is, having had the opportunity to study in the West, to have the facility to be able to converse in English, to have had the honor to serve His Holiness for such a long time, one of the things that I've always, wondered and wanted to see is, I as a Tibetan practitioner, having been a monk, when I think about Tsongkhapa, the kind of imagery that comes to me, the experiences that I have, the powerful way in which it hits me here, I wish I could convey this, communicate this in a language and a format that would speak to the modern reader. You don't have to be a believer to be inspired by what Tsongkhapa stood for, what his accomplishments are. And I really wanted to see a way in which if I can write his biography in a way that would really put him on the map, as it were, in the history of someone with a real international world stature, of a thinker, a philosopher, a teacher, a writer, and a master. You don't have to be Buddhist. I'm a great admirer of Thomas Aquinas. I'm not a Christian. I can appreciate what he stood for, what were his accomplishments, how influential he was in really defining what Catholic theology stood for, what was the Platonic underpinning of Catholic theology that really had a huge impact on incorporating Aristotelian philosophy into Catholicism, which really made this a very powerful, view for the church. I can, as a non-Christian, I can appreciate this. I can appreciate someone like Thomas Aquinas as a great thinker from a global point of view in the history of human thought. Why can't we do something similar to a Tibetan historical figure? Because otherwise what happens is that appreciation of the great Tibetan Lamas are kind of, confined to very devotional, esoteric, Vajrayana admiration, which is fine. But that only speaks to that particular group of people and that particular community. There must be a way in which Tsongkhapa's contribution and Tsongkhapa's great achievements could be appreciated without presupposing that you are a Buddhist, that you are a Vajrayana believer, that you are a admirer of Tibetan tradition. So that was the challenge I took on. And I wanted to begin in an auspicious way. And those of many of you are members of Tibetan Buddhist tradition, so Tibetans, there are aspects of Tibetan culture that is fairly superstitious. Some of those, even someone like myself, who is probably one of the most rational kind of, members of the community, even I wouldn't be able to escape, which is the idea of auspiciousness. Tibetans are obsessed with tashiba, the auspiciousness. So when we begin something, like if you're starting a new center or buying a new house, you want to start it in the right note, And there's even a saying that if you get the first date wrong, the whole month gets wrong, So there's even this saying that it's really getting the first thing right is really crucial, You're basically setting the tone, catching the right note. So I also think it that way, For me, auspiciousness is crucial. So I chose the right date. I said, this was in Dharamsala, so I rented a flat. Unfortunately, one of the things that inspired me to write was 4 volumes of most of Tsongkhapa's biographies were compiled together from Tibet and published in a book format. And in those 4 volumes, especially the first one, contained few biographies that were known to be extant. They were not known to be extant. I've heard about their names, but I've never seen the text themselves. But fortunately, some monks in Tibet managed to acquire those, put them into a type and printed them out. And there were particularly 2 texts in that collection. One particular one, which is about what we call the conventional biography of Tsongkhapa, which is really from the human perspective. You have Samwe Namtar, which is the secret biography. Secret biographies tend to focus a lot more on the visionary experiences, but Namtar Tumongwa, which is the conventional biography, really tells the story of Tsongkhapa as a human being. That is at least the idea. But this particular text, which was the source for many subsequent biographies, was written by two of Tsongkhapa's attendants who nursed him when he was ill for 2 years at Ganden towards the end of his life. And the colophon of that particular biography contains the phrase that this was compiled on the basis of 21 sessions of conversations with the master himself, notes taken down and later verified by the master. So that text turned up. So that was the one that really inspired me. I said, now I can do something. So when I began, I rented a place. My two girls were in summer camp so they were coming up only on Saturday. My wife went to Ladakh because she's doing a voluntary project, so which meant I had no distraction, no excuse. And then I did it. I wanted to really plunge into this writing in an inspired state of mind, for a month. And I began every morning with Gandalhagyama Guru Yoga practice, one round of Mitsima, Tsongkhapa's name mantra, and then write the whole day. So that was how I began, and I felt actually quite inspired that entire month. And one of the things that I really wanted to do in this book is to try to get the human Tsongkhapa out of this huge mythology that is built around him, because he's revered as the founder of Gelug tradition, of course, the founder of Ganden. He's seen as a Vajrayana, Vajradhara himself. There's a whole, once you look at from that aspect, it's very difficult to see the human Tsongkhapa behind that huge over almost 600 years of, narrative building. And I wanted to, somehow get the human story of someone who was actually adopted by a major Lama in Amdo, Choje, Tundurinchen, at the age of 6, groomed, and age 16 going to central Tibet, studying at the major monasteries of Kadam and Sakya, doing the rounds of debate, struggling with the major texts. I really wanted to go through all of that in a way that would tell a story of someone who's really, because otherwise the story becomes very simple. You have Tsongkhapa born, and then the traditional biographies tell you all these prophecies and dreams, which all returns him into an enlightened being who is displaying the act of being born. And the next thing you know, he's an enlightened being. There's nothing in between. That is... And we know from our own personal experience that just isn't, especially for me, it doesn't speak. I like to see the struggles. And so what I wanted to do was to really, and there's enough material because, some of his biographies were written soon after his passing and based on stories by eyewitness. And so that was what I was trying to do. And one thing that, when I was growing up as a monk in Ganden, we take things for granted, okay? So when you're part of a culture, there are certain things you don't see because it's just too close up. Sometimes to see the details, you need to take a kind of a distance point of vantage from. You have to look at something from a vantage point of view, because then you see it in the larger context. So when you are part of that culture, you really don't see that point of reference. And this is how I grew up. I grew up in India, in a traditional Tibetan family, be part of the refugee community, went to monastery. I studied all of this. And one thing that, after coming to the West and studying in Cambridge and everything, then I started to look at Tsongkhapa within the context of, great thinkers of the world, great masters of the world. How would he fare? In which case, then, what is his unique contribution? What really, if you look at Tsongkhapa now, okay, he has a status that is of an enlightened being. For the Geluk members, he's a truly enlightened being. So we don't really see, and we take it for granted that his teachings, especially his Madhyamaka philosophy of emptiness, his Vajrayana teachings, we don't see the development of how he got there. We because we receive it in its entirety, and from a practitioner's point of view, that's perfectly fine. And in fact, that's how it should be, because you need to have a deep engagement with the entirety of the practice. But from a biography or appreciation of the history of ideas point of view, then you need to have a bit more nuanced understanding of how he got there, and also to appreciate why Tsongkhapa matters. Why do we make so much fuss about him? With His Holiness too, who is a great ecumenical teacher, who has admiration for all the Tibetan traditions. He teaches teachings of Geluk, Satya, Nyingma, Kagyu. But when it comes to individuals, figures within the history of Tibetan Buddhism, Tsongkhapa has a very exalted status for him. He deeply reveres Tsongkhapa and admires him. So most of us who have been brought up in this tradition, even the non-Geluks, will take Tsongkhapa very seriously. So what is all this fuss about, this master? So unless you have some appreciation of what was his unique contribution, how he get there, then you don't really fully appreciate the importance of this. So one of the things that I noticed is, of course, when he was studying, he was a brilliant scholar, emerging when he went through the rounds. All of this is just well documented. But one probably very early seminal experiences he had was his exposure to the newly compiled Kanguru and Tenguru, which had been commissioned by Tsebakunga Doji, a great historian, and the editor was Thupten. And Thupten was the one who completely finalized the Tibetan canon of Kanguru and Tenguru. And the entire set was sponsored and housed at Tselkungdam Monastery, which is an early Kagyu monastery. And Tsongkhapa came across this, and he was totally blown away by these texts. He spent 4 years in intensive reading retreat at this place, Tsekongdang. 4 years. He did a little bit of travel here and there. He did a Nyungne fasting retreat at the in the Lhasa Chogang temple, because Tsekongdang is quite close to Lhasa. But otherwise, he really kind of camped himself. And so he was not even 30, he was 28, 29. Around 28, 29. And then by 29, when he was about 3 years into his reading, he began writing Golden Rosary, sitting, his earliest great philosophical writing, in a major writing, which is in 2 large volumes. And by the time he finished it, he was 31, he was a completely changed man. Those 4 years of intensive reading, and we kind of, vaguely know what the sort of the daily routine he was observing, but and after that, you can see a marked difference in the tone and style of his writing. After that, basically, he was interested primarily in the direct Indian sources. Up until that point, he was studying Tibetan commentaries, previous Tibetan masters, and so on. But after his 4-year sojourn at Tselkungdang, it was all about Indian tradition. That was age 31. His sitting came out, completely established his reputation as a great scholar, because sitting, even to this day, has never been superseded as a piece of writing on classical Indian Buddhist text It's a remarkable piece of writing, written by a young man, and the level of literary standard and the academic scholarship. Many of the things that we assume to be modern inventions, like text critical analysis and situating a text in a particular context and, anticipating literature review, it was all there. We tend to think these are modern kind of inventions or great modern humanistic tradition. If you look at Tse Chen, it's an amazing piece of writing that really established his name. And from that point onwards, he would very rarely cite a Tibetan writing as an authoritative source. He would study them as a point of reference. From that point onwards, it was all about making sense of the inherited Indian tradition, Sutra, Tantra, Shastra. And this is what made Tsongkhapa very unique. And he was actually a kind of a maverick. He never really identified with any particular established lineage of his time. His main teacher was Rendawa. Rendawa was a great mind at the time, especially on Madhyamaka and Brahmana epistemology scholarship. And Rendawa and Tsongkhapa's relationship, they were about 8 years difference. Rendawa was 8 years older. Rendawa was a complete Sakyapa, established based mostly at Sakya Monastery, but other places. Tsongkhapa, after Tsongkhapa became Rendawa's student, their relationship really flowered. But Rendawa, right from the beginning, seemed to have really appreciated Tsongkhapa's kind of independence. Rendawa's biography turned up a couple of years ago, written by his attendant. So I had the privilege to read that, and there's a lot of reference to Tsongkhapa and the relationship between the two. And Rendawa, right from the beginning, recognized that in Tsongkhapa there is a totally exceptional protege, and his role was to really kind of nurture him and bring that out. Over time, their relationship grew from teacher-student to more of a colleague. And towards the end of Rendawa's life, Rendawa began receiving teachings from Tsongkhapa, especially on Guhyasamaja. So their relationship really changed, and Rendawa's biography actually kind of notes that. And we also have access to Rendawa's letters, and some of letters to Tsongkhapa are preserved. There's a very lengthy letter written by Rendawa when Tsongkhapa was in a retreat in Wolka. And you can see the relationship between the two. So Rendawa was himself a Sakya, but Tsongkhapa would take teachings from Rendawa, visit him at Sakya, but he did not seem to have really aligned himself as a member of the Sakya tradition. Similarly, he had very close relationship with many Kagyu masters. In fact, his earliest exposure to Tibetan tradition in central Tibet came through Kagyu, not through Kadampa. Because when he arrived in central Tibet, he landed at Digung Til Monastery because he joined a caravan that was bringing offerings to Digung Til Monastery. And Digung Til became his kind of base in central Tibet for a little while. In fact, when his family, like his mother, was sending gifts to him or letters to him, they would put the Digung Til address. It will arrive in Digung Til, and they will locate where Tsongkhapa is and get the materials to him. So, and after Digung Til, there is another Kagyu tradition which no longer exists called Pagdru Kagyu. And Pagdru Kagyu was a very important tradition because at that time, the ruling government of Tibet was the Pagdru dynasty, and Pagdru dynasty was very closely aligned to Pagdru Kagyu. And Pagdru Kagyu had two main monasteries. One is the Densa Til, which is their main monastery. The other one is Tsetang, which is an academic monastery established by the founder of the Pagdru dynasty. So Tsongkhapa had a very close relationship with the then ruler of Pagdru, who was only a year older than Tsongkhapa, Thakpa Changchu. And they immediately hit off each other. And then the relationship between Pakdru rulers and Tsongkhapa became very firm. And after Thapa Chanju passed on the rulership, finally in 1385, young Thapa Gyaltsen became the ruler, and Thapa Gyaltsen already knew Tsongkhapa when he was a kid. Tsongkhapa was a young Lama, a young monk. And during Tsongkhapa's entire life, there was a amazing political stability in central Tibet under the rule of this Paktu ruler, who was a great devotee and admirer of Tsongkhapa. So in him, Tsongkhapa had an amazing, enduring, reliable benefactor. Hence, he was able to establish Ganden. Hence, he was able to start this massive Monlam Chemo institution of, you're talking about feeding over 10,000 monks over a period of 15 days. That's not a small expense. So, and then, the Paktu ruler also became the sponsor for establishment of Drepung, which is a major monastery, Ganden, even site in Sera, which was founded in the year Tsongkhapa passed away. So, in some ways, Tsongkhapa was very lucky to have this coincidence of a political stability in central Tibet, because it wasn't that stable before. And on top of that, the ruling elite, they were all great admirers of Tsongkhapa. So Tsongkhapa had very close relationship with the Kagyu. Among all the various traditions, it was the Kagyu that he has the closest relationship because of that relation. And his early practices, if you look at the biography, seem to have been mainly Mahamudra type practice. So he received the Mahamudra teachings from Thapa Chanchu. So this is well documented in his own record of teachings received, Senyig. With the Kadampas, of course, he studied at Nenying Monastery, which is a Kadam monastery, and Dewachen, Nyatang Dewachen is the main Kadam monastery that we studied. Sangpu is where Abhidharma and Vinaya were very important, being studied. And Nartang. Sangpu was where the epistemology was, studied. But again, with the Kadampas, if you look at his admiration of Kadampa, it really is kind of confined to the area of Lamrim teaching and Lojong. Not really so much in the philosophy domain. On Madhyamaka, you don't see Tsongkhapa quoting the great Kadampa teachers. Not even Atisha himself. Very rarely he would quote Atisha. What he would quote would be Buddha Palita, Chandrakirti, and so on, who are the great founding figures of the Madhyamaka tradition itself. So clearly, he was a maverick. He never really liked being allied or being part of an institutional kind of organized community. And even when, during all of his long-standing relationship with the Paktu ruler, he was never interested in political positions. The relationship was always informal. He very rarely bothered to actually visit the palaces themselves. He had the Paktu ruler sponsor various teachings that he was giving, but he sort of kept a distance. He had a good personal relationship, but there was no formalized, relationship like he's the imperial, preceptor and all of this. None of this seemed to have, sort of attracted him. And in fact, in one of his early writings, he was a great poet, actually, by the way. That was I translated some of his poems. And one of his early poems, he was probably in his mid-20s. There's a beautiful line where he actually makes a prayer that he never be vulnerable to the temptations of power, fame, and wealth. And this is being written when he was in his mid-20s. So he really seemed to have had this absolute integrity. And he also knew the weakness of the human nature, that there is a beautiful verse where he makes the prayer that may he never be tempted by these kind of forces. So throughout his life, I think he maintained that kind of purity. And one of the things that amazed me is, I'm now jumping ahead a bit, is another thing that he was quite, adamant about is not getting attached to any particular place. So he calls himself a wanderer to indeterminate places. So he really seemed to have believed that if you stay for too long in one place, you're going to get attached. And so he was actually quite adamant not to stay in one place for too long. So even when he was in a 3-year retreat in the World Cup, and he went to 3-year retreat at the strong urging of Manjushri, and one of the very intriguing aspects of Tsongkhapa's life, and especially from the modern reader's point of view, and that was one thing that I had to struggle in writing this biography, is this very unusual, intriguing relationship that he had with Manjushri, almost in the form of a human, guru. And he refers to him as a Jayan Lama, Guru Manjushri. And that relationship initially doesn't seem to have been direct. It was always mediated through another person. Initially, Umapa Pawodoji, Lama Umapa, who actually had a visionary experience himself and then sought out Tsongkhapa. And then later, through one of his senior students, Thupten Jinpa, who had visionary experiences of Manjushri, so he was being the medium. Later, then finally, Tsongkhapa himself had direct encounter. And, since I was writing this biography from a kind of a modern perspective, I have to try to put on the skeptic's hat and try to see how can someone who's not brought into this kind of culture really make sense of something like this. Now, the basic idea of visionary encounter isn't alien outside Buddhism. You have, in the Christian tradition, they have visionary experiences. It's not an alien concept. But what is intriguing is that it's not just a fleeting visionary encounters, but there seems to be a sustained relationship where actually Tsongkhapa was receiving teachings through that medium. So that is a harder thing to kind of get, So I was trying to sort of get a sense of this. And one thing that became quite clear is, regardless of whatever may have been happening, clearly there was a phenomenon going on. That cannot be denied. Okay, now how you explain that phenomenon, of course, is another matter. But clearly there was a phenomenon. And Tsongkhapa is a very clear-thinking person who has absolute integrity. Why would he make up something like that? On top of that, there's a reference to this quite extensively in Rendava's writing about Tsongkhapa's visionary experiences. And then there is a communication between Tsongkhapa and Lama Umapa, who returns to Eastern Tibet, about Tsongkhapa himself having experiences and Thupten Jinpa also having experiences. Then I read around this in, for example, there is a 16th century history or biographies of Kagyu masters, Kamsang Kagyu masters. And there was quite a lot of reference to Tsongkhapa because the Shamar, the third Shamar and fourth Shamar, they were actually, they had received transmissions of some of Tsongkhapa's texts. And Tsongkhapa himself, his novice vows, the Genyen vows was given by Karmapa Rinpoche when he was on his way back from China, when Tsongkhapa was 3 years old. And then the next Karmapa Dishin Shekpa, had a close relationship with Tsongkhapa. So there was quite a strong connection with the Karma Kagyus and the Karmapas. So there were quite a bit of reference. And then the author of the Blue Annals, Goilozawa Shunupel, who was a Kagyupa, but he was also a student of Tsongkhapa. And Goilozawa's biography also talks about Tsongkhapa a lot. So in all of these writings of the great important masters of that period, they were all taken for granted that Tsongkhapa was having constant visionary experiences of, now you can call it collective delusion. But clearly all of these great minds around his time took it for granted that this is real. So there is a phenomenon going on. Anyway, so Manjushri, there are some, I try to sort of capture this. Of course I'm a Tibetan Buddhist. I believe, fervently in this, I've been exposed to science a lot, but I never bought into this reductionist idea that everything can be reduced to movements of the chemicals in your brain. It just doesn't make any sense, So I genuinely, but I wanted to somehow capture that in the writing. And the way in which I tried to do was to do it through the power of the narrative, power of the story. And there are some, there's one beautiful, for me at least, scenery where Umapa is going to go back to Eastern Tibet. Tsongkhapa had joined Umapa in Lhasa to say, goodbye. So they spent few, weeks together in Lhasa. They had their own individual rooms, but they will have their meals together, lunch. They were both they were strict. They were not having dinner. But Tsongkhapa never had dinner, so he was quite strictly observing the Vinaya rules. They were breakfast and lunch together, but they were meditating separately, and then they were having conversations. So on one day before Umapa leaves back for Eastern Tibet, they arranged a teaching session on the rooftop of the Chogang on the southeastern side. They found a shade, and Tsongkhapa gives Lama Umapa a short empowerment ceremony of Guhya Samaja, and then Lama Umapa gets into this medium state and gives an instruction to Tsongkhapa from Manjushri. And it's a really beautiful, so when I saw that, I said, brilliant, there's something visual, So there are things like that which are actually quite powerful. And then one of the teachings is actually, I don't know if I brought my glasses here. It's in the yellow bag there, sorry. Thanks. So let me just quickly take a look at one of the teachings. You can see I don't know if I'm going to find it though. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to find it easily. I should have made a note, but some of these teachings, there's a particular one that was written down by Tsongkhapa. It's only got about 18 lines, but it's a very, very interesting teaching. And I'm kind of surprised that in the Gelug tradition, we never took that teaching seriously and disseminated it. There are some commentaries written on it, but it's in 18 quite cryptic lines, and some of those are quite powerful because it really talks about beginning with settling your mind through kind of a shamatha practice, and then being able to really learn to experience a total letting go, attachment. And then it begins, goes on to the meditation on no self, which is the personal identity, and then meditation on the aggregates, which is the basis of that personal identity. And the imagery that is used is that somehow like the horn of a rabbit, which is a stock example that is given in the Indian text of a non-existent things, is characterized as the proof of the emptiness of phenomena. I mean, that's an intriguing idea, that, horn of a rabbit is the proof of emptiness of phenomena. I mean, you have to sort of, twist your mind around. And then it eventually ends up with establishing the equanimity of emptiness and the wisdom realizing it, which is the non-duality. It's a beautiful teaching, all in 18 lines. And it's, all the biographies recorded, Tsongkhapa's own collected works recorded as a teaching received directly from Manjushri. So clearly, this teaching, quite short, so in this busy day, it's not a bad teaching to have, and it's very short. And the pedigree of that is quite powerful. If it is coming directly from Manjushri, it must have power. I mean, when I first, I have been exposed to these lines before because, I've read Tsongkhapa's biography, and also one of the things that I had a chance once to do when I was at Ganden was my own teacher, Zemer Rinpoche, Gyabje Zemer Rinpoche, gave the reading transmission of the entire collected works of Tsongkhapa and his two disciples. So there are about 30-something volumes in the entire series. And when a Lama gives a reading transmission, Lama needs a senior student, not necessarily a senior student, but a good writer, who sits behind the Lama's throne and has another set of the entire text and keeps track of where he is. And then you make a note at the beginning of every session where he stopped and where he began, so that any important geshis and lamas who are attending this entire month-long or sometimes 2-month-long sessions, if they have to go somewhere and miss a session, they will write down what session they missed, and then they will consult the scribe. And I was the scribe because I would have created a small booklet, and they will check which one they missed, and then they will get that reading transmission from someone else. That way they have the thing complete. So anyway, to cut a long story short, I was the scribe for my teacher, which meant I had the chance to read through the entire collected works of Tsongkhapa, of course at a very fast pace, because he's reading it aloud, but also, by then I was quite a fast reader, and I always had a curious mind, and I was just not that just alone Dharma, but I was very interested in a lot of other stuff. So I had come across, everything that was written, and that verse, 18 lines, kind of intrigued me. But when I worked on this biography, I took a closer look at them. So some of those aspects of Tsongkhapa's life is very interesting, and from a experiential point of view, at Manjushri's urging, Tsongkhapa then went for a 3-year hermit life. Manjushri said, give up everything. Give up everything, be a chatelwa. Chatelwa is a Tibetan term which means you have nothing to do. Sort of chawa is action or activity, telwa is free. So someone who has nothing to do. So this is the typical Tibetan word we use for hermits, who has nothing to do, And Tsongkhapa took 8 of his close disciples. Each one of them were recommended by Manjushri. And when they began, it was actually quite strict. Tsongkhapa, this comes in Thupten Jinpa's biography, which actually turned up in Tibet. This is the senior monk who's actually a year older than Tsongkhapa. He was also from Amdo. The Thupten Jinpa's biography says that, it talks about up to where they walked, they took the boat, and then they walked further to this beautiful valley in Wolka, southwestern Tibet. No, actually more in southeastern Tibet. In the initial stage, Tsongkhapa banned any of his students, including himself, bringing any Vajrayana texts. They wanted to start from the foundational practice, with the Ngondros, with the Lamrim practice. The only exception given was Thupten Jinpa, who had just completed receiving the transmission of Lamdre, and because he has visionary experiences of Manjushri, he was allowed to bring a tanka of Manjushri and his Lamdre daily practice. That's all. The rest, nobody was allowed to bring Vajrayana text. And that's how they began. They began in a really strict Kadampa approach of purification practice, bodhicitta, and basic Lamrim practice. That's how they began. And part of that experience involved restoration of the Dzingchi Maitreya. And the first year and a half, almost 2 years of the retreat period, was for Tsongkhapa very deeply devotional experiences. Some of his beautiful devotional hymns to Maitreya and Manjushri and Sarasvati were written during that period. So he seemed to have been really, and one of the things that people who have experienced devotions, whether in the form of your relationship with your teacher or others, is that devotion, if you have that kind of natural inclination, can be a very powerful, method for bringing your mind to a very quietened state. Because a lot of our chatter, restlessness in our mind really comes from self-talk, self-referential conversations that are going on in our head, which keeps the mind very busy. The beauty of devotion is the focus is completely not you. It's on your guru, on your meditation deity, on whatever it is. You have stepped out of your shell. And that's why it has this power. But of course, that aspect can be abused, and we do see that sometimes happening. When you in the process, you should not lose your critical ability or acumen. But if you are able to harness that, it really has a powerful practice. And one of the reasons why a lot of people love to be around His Holiness is because they've experienced this, like this, without having to struggle. That is the power of devotion. And Tsongkhapa, during those retreat, the initial stage, whatever writing he did had this powerful devotional tone to his writing. And he seems to have really gone through these very, very deeply devotional experiences. And he began having all sorts of visions of not just Manjushri, but other things. Because that makes sense, because once your mind is taken to a very deep level, quietened of the self-chatter, it opens up a whole new world and experience. And we can kind of at least sense that this is true. Occasionally, if we're lucky, we can experience those moments, but at least you can make sense that once you quieten the self-chatter, open up your heart, there's a whole new world of experience there. And this is what seems to have happened with Tsongkhapa. But even then, he never stayed in one retreat. There was Eureka Ling, Eureka Hating, Je Tsongkhapa Ling. There were at least 4 different, and Kharpuk. So initially, when he first went there, because of his connection with Densa Til, Kagyu Monastery, there was a branch, a retreat, hermitage, that is associated with Densa Til. This is where Tsongkhapa first stayed with his attendants. And then the local ruler built a special hermitage for Tsongkhapa, which he moved to. After that, he moved to another cave, which was used by Gampopa as well, so Karbuk. So he moved around. So he would stay a couple of months, then move to the next one. There's a letter that he wrote to the Pagdu ruler who had invited Tsongkhapa, and Tsongkhapa wrote back saying that, sorry, I've made a pledge not to be near a town for a couple of years. So he says, so he seemed to have, this comes up several times in his writing that, in a letter he would say, sorry, I can't see you because I've made the pledge not to climb down from the mountain kind of thing, So really, me papa. So there is a letter that he writes to the ruler. Of course, he can't totally dismiss him. He's the powerful ruler of Tibet. But on the other hand, he didn't want to go to see him in the palace. So there's a beautiful letter he writes. And the opening part of the letter where he says that, I have made the pledge not to step down from the mountain, there's a description of one of his hermitages. The scenery, the area around it is beautiful, poetic. And when you read it, you get a sense of, being in a kind of a cloud state of mind. I mean, it's just beautifully written. So that really began to sort of trigger a thought in me. Why is he constantly in some retreat and always high up in a mountain? Then maybe I'm just reading too much, but one thing that I realized is when he was 6 years old, he was adopted by Chöje Tendurinchen and taken to Chagyung Monastery, which is in Amdo. And Chagyung Monastery it's located in this beautiful mountain top. It's a ridge overlooking this massive valley with a yellow river in front of you. Imagine, he was there for 6 years as a kid, not 9, almost 10 years. By the time he left, he was 16. So he grew up in this amazing landscape with a powerful vista of this open space in front of you. Of course, you're going to be, I think this is probably one of the reasons why, until he established Ganden, he was constantly on the move, and he was always, whenever possible, he was in a hermitage. So this comes through quite clearly by looking at the colophons of his writings, because most of the colophons in his writing contains where he wrote it and when he wrote it. So that's why, not always when he wrote it, but most of the time where he wrote it, including his letters. In the colophon, he writes about where he wrote it from. So towards the end, as Tsongkhapa started attracting students in his sort of mid-30s, late 30s, he started gathering students of his own. And towards the end, when he moved from one place to another place and started giving a teaching, he was being accompanied by monks about several hundreds in number. And some of the Gyaltsab, his senior student, finally, and Dulcin said to Tsongkhapa, this is ridiculous. Who's going to feed us? Because it was becoming a massive enterprise for the community to move from one place to another place. So initially he was just 8, followers, attendants, and then, maybe 15, 20 or 30. But towards the end, it was becoming very, very big, and it's only the major rulers or leaders who could support them. So he was requested, and then of course only in 1409, Tsongkhapa finally said yes. But I tried to read through the lines to see whether he was just walking everywhere. And I've never found a reference anywhere of him riding a horse. And it makes sense. He's meeting with the senior Kadampa master, where he goes to see the Kadampa master, and the Kadampa master at a later point comes to see Tsongkhapa. In that meeting, there is a reference to the senior Kadampa master leaving the monastery and riding a horse, saddling a horse. But nowhere in Tsongkhapa's description was there ever any reference to horse. So I have a feeling he was basically doing what the Buddha did. Buddha walked. If you look at the Theravada scriptures have a much more human portrayal of the Buddha's life, where he went. And also we have archaeological, some indications of which, how far Buddha went, basically. And if you can just look at an Indian map, Central Indian map at the time, you can see the distance up to where you can walk. I mean, you can't, if you're just walking, you cannot go from Kashmir down to Kanyakumari. It's just too far, But if you're staying within the Central Indian territory, you could pretty much get from, one place to another place. And if you look at Tsongkhapa's activity, and my hope is that in this book, I've requested Shambhala, who's my publisher, to try to get a map in this. You can see that basically he must have been walking, and his area of activity was confined to Lhasa, southern. He went to Tsari, Kalachakra, pilgrim in the Tsari, which is on the Indian border. He was in Hloka, and he was in Thakpo Menlong, which is the southeast. And then, of course, he did the huge trek from Amdo, which took him almost a year when he first came. Then the furthest north he went was Ngamring, which is more on the northern side. And then Sakya and Shalu and Shigatse area, which is the western part. But beyond that, he never went. And after he came into his own stature as a teacher, he then did not go to the Sakya and Tsang area, because these are the areas where his teacher was active. So it's probably out of deference to Rendawa. So his area of activity was really in the Lhasa environment and Wolka, this whole retreat area, and then the southeastern area, and then on the Rading, those areas which is further kind of north, sort of northeast. So it looks like he was literally walking, and the biography actually records where he camped for the night, sometimes when it was too cold. So it seems that Tsongkhapa was, quite a character, actually. I mean, he was, there is also some description of his own personality. He was very, very polite, always very kind, and very attentive to his students. And whenever students asked questions, he would always repeat the question back to clarify and then respond. And so apparently he, as someone from Eastern Tibet, he was quite tall, and his nickname was the big-nosed Amdo fellow. So there's a description of his kind of character, and so it's now one area which was very fascinating for me was the biography, as well as his own writings captured this. Even after 3 years of retreat in Wolka, where he made huge amount of progress in his realization, there was one area where he remained unsatisfied. That was his view on emptiness. Now, this is quite fascinating for us, scholars, because, we study Madhyamaka after we become Geshe Laramba. We kind of feel we got it, But here is one of the greatest minds of Tibet, who after 3 years of retreat, having gone through the entire training, still come out unsatisfied with his understanding of emptiness. So what is going on? So suggest we are not getting it. What is it that we are not getting? This whole section, and I have a whole chapter on, the Eureka Moment. I didn't call it the Eureka Moment because it was a little too blasé. I call it Finding the View. Finally, finding the view. And that chapter was, for me, a very interesting chapter to write, as someone who has been brought up in philosophy, both in the East and the West, and also trying to sort of get a sense of where the struggle is coming from, and what seems to have happened is that Tsongkhapa Before his time, when he was a student, Madhyamaka doesn't seem to have been part of the formal discipline of scholarship. He was known as Kashipa, which is the master of 4 disciplines. So these are perfection of wisdom studies, Abhidhamma, Vinaya, and Pramana, which is epistemology. So Madhyamaka doesn't seem to have become part of a formal discipline. Although texts were being studied, translated way before, by the time Gyaltsab finished his studies, Madhyamaka had already become part of the formal discipline. And Gyaltsab was known as Kachupa, master of 10 treatises, and 2 of those were Madhyamaka treatises. So, in any case, Madhyamaka scholarship was quite widespread, and Tsongkhapa's own teacher, Randawa, was instrumental in reviving, Madhyamaka scholarship in Tibet. He was one of the great Madhyamaka masters. He wrote commentaries on major Madhyamaka texts. Why didn't Tsongkhapa basically adopt what his own teacher had said, who had written 2 major commentaries on Nagarjuna's text and Chandrakirti's text? Tsongkhapa, here is where the independence comes in. He had deep reverence to his teachers, but he just wouldn't take, you say so. That wasn't his style. He needed to do the hard work himself. He needed, whatever understanding he arrived at, he needed to do the work himself. And Madhyamaka was one area where he really struggled. Now, I don't think he struggled in understanding what the text is saying. I think he struggled in making an emotional sense of what the implications of this radical teaching means. Because, even the Madhyamakas, they're all Buddhists. The proponents of Philosopher of Emptiness are all Mahayana Buddhists who believe in the possibility of attainment of Buddhahood, who believe the sanctity of the Bodhicitta, who believe the possibility of purification of the mind, Buddha nature. How do you square the 2 things? Because if you look at Nagarjuna's teaching on Madhyamaka, particularly as interpreted by Chandrakirti, it is bordering on total nihilism. It is actually, you have to make sense of the very notion of existence in a non-objective way. Nothing can be grounded objectively. If nothing can be grounded objectively, where does the regularity of karma, cause and effect, come from? How do you understand that? How do you understand the place of Buddha nature and the possibility of enlightenment if there is nothing objectively grounded? If you think through this problem, it is a serious problem. And that serious problem is at the heart of Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Because the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, unlike in India, we integrated. In India, you had Yogacara traditions who will take less radical interpretation of the Buddha's teaching on emptiness. For them, not everything is empty. Okay? So you have less radical interpretation of the profession of wisdom teachings. You emphasize the Buddha nature, Alaya Vijnana, the foundational, the store consciousness teaching. Okay? You have, the subjective experience and the mind becomes primary. It has intrinsic reality. So you have a kind of an objective grounding of samsara and nirvana. You have the Madhyamakas. Most of them, at least the Indian Madhyamakas, didn't take Buddha nature teaching that seriously. If they took it at all, they would interpret in the form of emptiness of the unenlightened mind. So it was nothing can be formulated in positive language, in the Nagarjunian fashion. The moment you use a positive language to describe ultimate reality, you are giving grounds to grasp. That was Nagarjunan insight. And that is a powerful insight into human psychology. Because we know from our own personal experience, the moment we value something, our mind immediately will latch onto it. And that's one of the reasons why Buddhism in general rejects the notion of eternal self and God. Because anything that is absolute, attachment is going to come. Because if it is that important, you value it, you invest emotionally, grasping immediately follows. So that was the Nagarjunan line of thinking. Radical negation, absolute negation. Nothing, 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 nothing. Okay? What you leave is just the experience. So for the Indians, it was not a problem. But for the Tibetans, it was a problem because we integrated these two teachings. You have two sets of treatises, one coming from Maitreya and Asanga, that emphasizes the Yogacara, mind, and Buddha nature. One coming from the Nagarjuna that emphasizes the ontology of radical emptiness. How do you square the two? How do you fit, what's the English expression? Square peg in a round hole. That was the problem for the Tibetans. And Tsongkhapa was the one who really took that problem seriously. Okay, how do you square that? And I think this is what he meant when he said that I haven't found it. Even when he came out of the retreat. He was a great philosopher and he needed to make sense at this very fundamental level. And so the Eureka Moment comes, and this is an interesting thing because, and this is still, Tibetans, I suppose, in the end, maybe I'll be accused of being rather iconoclastic here, but maybe part of the softening of the acuteness of that problem really came because of Vajrayana. Because Vajrayana brought a different level of discourse and different level of relationship with language and concepts and experiences. But at the philosophical level, these two are difficult to reconcile. And Tsongkhapa was right. Now, eventually, of course, thank goodness, the Eureka Moment did come. And this came in the form of a dream, actually. And some of you might be familiar. He was doing a lot of Vajrayana practices, but also continuing with his emptiness meditation. And one night he had a dream of Nagarjuna surrounded by four great masters, Bhavaviveka, Buddhapalita, Chantakirti, and then there's another person, I think basically the three main teachers. And he dreamt of them engaging in a conversation. And then he dreamt Buddhapalita placing a text on his head in the form of a blessing. Next day, coincidentally, someone came with a gift of a copy of the Buddhapalita text to Tsongkhapa, and he immediately recognized the symbolism, sat down, and read it through and meditated. And when he was reading the chapter 18, that was when he had the Eureka Moment. And it's actually, and then he does describe, in the immediate aftermath, what he did was to write this beautiful poem, hymn to the Buddha, that we all know. It's in praise of dependent origination, which is, the heart of that Eureka Moment really took the form of realizing what Nagarjuna means when he says that emptiness is equivalent to dependent origination. So it's like emptiness here, the equivalent signs, and dependent origination. And so that was the heart of the experience of that Eureka, that emptiness has to be understood in terms of dependent origination. And this is where what Nagarjuna means is that for someone who emptiness is possible, everything is possible. For whom emptiness is not possible, nothing is possible. This is what Nagarjuna means. And this is essentially the insight also of the sutra, where form is emptiness, emptiness is form. And apart from emptiness, there's no form. And apart from form, there's no emptiness. So this is fourfold emptiness and dependent origination relationship. And that relationship has to be that of equivalence. One not necessarily just implying the other, but actually one turning into the other. And this whole equivalence of dependent origination and emptiness then becomes the heart of Tsongkhapa's writing on Madhyamaka. And so then he writes that praise to the, in praise of dependent origination. And I hope in the Gelug centers at least, this text is taught. It's a beautifully written Tibetan poetry. It's also, because it's quite a short text, what it is dealing with is tough. But then who says philosophy is simple? Yeah, and one of the very powerful insight that Tsongkhapa comes up with is, in fact, not so much, of course, the philosophical insight is very powerful, but the more powerful, at least from my understanding, is the insight into the psychology of emptiness. So what Tsongkhapa ends up saying, and here he's really following Nagarjuna very closely, he's saying that there is something fundamental to the human mind which manifests in the form of grasping. And that grasping latches on to anything, particularly nouns, because, verbs are a little better because it's referring to a process, it's referring to an action. But when you use nouns, and nouns in the form of, things and properties, you have nouns and adjectives, it's, in a sense, we can't avoid it because this is what makes us humans. Language makes us humans, We want to describe. We all experience, here is this thing, and this is one of the reasons why Chomsky is right, that there is something universal to the grammar. Because if the human experience is universal, then at the very basic level, the mechanisms for communication and articulating that in through language has to be universal. There's a certain finite structures to which how language is going to formulate, which is just as you can speak of things and their properties, we use nouns and adjectives. And then just as we experience things in a particular way, we use adverbs to convey that mood. So there is something, and this is one of the reasons why some philosophers got totally enamored by language and started believing that language actually refers like a one-to-one correspondence, in a form of a denotation. Buddhists generally tend to reject that. But what Tsongkhapa is saying is that the human mind is shaped by this kind of experience from a very, very early stage. And from the Buddhist point of view, going all the way back to previous lives, this vasana, the habitual propensities that we can't but help grasp. And so when we grasp, it's at that level, both at the level of perceptual experience as well as cognitive understanding, we cannot rationally differentiate between the thing itself and the things that we attribute over and above what exists there. So this is what intrinsic existence is. Intrinsic existence is the objective character dimension that we attribute onto things, and we can never differentiate between this. So the power of emptiness is to constantly challenge that perspective. And initially, because we can't experientially tease them out, we have to do it through reasoning. We have to do it through rational approach, using arguments, drawing absurd consequences of if things were to possess such intrinsic nature, what would be the implications? And that's why many of the reasoning for emptiness is in the form of consequence, throwing reasoning, absurdities. So, and this understanding, and in the technical Giluk language or Tibetan language, we talk about identifying the object of negation. This is actually, some scholars accuse Tsongkhapa of inventing this. Yeah. But on the other hand, of course, traditional Tibetans would be horrified by accused of inventing something, because innovation wasn't prized. You're supposed to be faithful to the previous masters. But on the other hand, if it is an innovation, that's a great thing, because it gives us a new psychological tool, understanding of the human mind, which helps us. So in the tradition, the Gajong Wenzen, this recognizing, identifying what is to be negated, is so crucial. That's why in the Giluk teachings, this is taken so seriously, because kind of everything hinges on this. Being able to really push to the limits of thinking. Gajong Wenzen is done through thinking, and you do that by, first of all, trying to understand what would be that hypothetical criteria or true existence look like. If things were to possess true existence, what would it look like? So you come up with this, and you push the limits of human mind and thinking to the point where you really begin to see, there are actually passages in Nagarjuna himself where he suggests that you could recast a whole language of noun and adjectives into relational language. I don't think it's doable, but there's a suggestion. But generally, there's even this idea that what is there is just relationships without any relator. That's a hard thing to get around, And again, we don't want to be reifying relationship either. So how do you go and keep pushing and pushing and pushing without completely sliding into nihilism? And this is where it's interesting. Actually, Chandrakirti himself was aware of this. There's an interesting section in his commentary on Nagarjuna's text where an opponent accuses the followers of Nagarjuna of being nihilist. And he says that what is the difference between materialist schools in India, these Charvakas who denied life after death, who denied the law of karma. What is the difference between a Charvaka's denial of life after death and your denial of the true existence of life after death? It's an interesting question. One is a non-existence, one is an absence of true existence, but this opponent says it sounds exactly the same. And if you push it, it's exactly the same. This is an interesting... So what I'm trying to say is that why is emptiness a big deal? Not just for the Tibetans. It's for the Chinese tradition. It's for the Zen tradition. For all the Mahayana traditions. Emptiness is a big deal. And really, it is, even in the sutra itself, emptiness is referred to as the door to liberation. And in fact, it says that emptiness refers to the true nature of things on the basis of which sentient beings delude and fall into samsara, and the yogis gain insight and move to nirvana. So it's basically what is the turning point, which direction you're going to go to. And Tsongkhapa's kind of insight, and I've tried to capture this. I don't know how far I've succeeded, but one of the interesting things is that in the light of this struggle with Tsongkhapa's Madhyamaka, there was an ongoing exchange between Tsongkhapa and Rendawa on the evolving views on emptiness, which is fascinating. And so I read those and I put them those and try to sort of get this sense. After the Eureka Moment, I think there was a total sense of ease in Tsongkhapa's mind. And then he really began the big project of writing his major text on Madhyamaka. The first one was Lamrim Chenmo. Lamrim Chenmo he wrote, again in a retreat setting at Rading, in one go. He seemed to have actually completed writing Lamrim Chenmo within a year, just over a year. And it was written at the request of a very senior Sakya and Kadam Lama, Lojeng Kyabcho Pelsang, who was himself a great Madhyamaka teacher. He was one of the main requesters. And Lojeng and Tsongkhapa were together at Radring when Lamrim Chenmo was written. After Lamrim Chenmo was written, the admiration for the Lamrim Chenmo was such that, including Lojeng, many people wrote to Tsongkhapa and said, "Can you do the same thing on Tantra?" So then he did the great exposition of Tantra. So basically these are the two main summaries, you can say, treatises, one on general treatises on Tantra, one on Sutra. He then wrote his Lekshen Nyingpo, which is Essence of True Eloquence, which is his independent text, where he uses the kind of the hermeneutics, distinguishing between the Buddha's definitive meaning and the provisional meaning of sutras, using the philosophy of Yogacara and Madhyamaka, which was then followed by commentary on Nagarjuna's text. After that, then he began writing only much later on Vajrayana. And by the time he was writing Vajrayana, he had already gained quite a lot of experience, because one of the key things about Tsongkhapa's writing is that for him, as well as Sakya Pandita, when it comes to the ultimate nature of phenomena, when it comes to emptiness, there is no difference between Sutra and Tantra. There is only one kind of emptiness, okay? And this is where Sakya Pandita is the same. So what makes Tantra unique is not because in Tantra you have a new discovery of the final truth. The discovery of the final truth is really the teaching on emptiness that the Nagarjuna presented. There's nothing beyond. Because if you assume there is a truth beyond to be found, then the Nagarjuna's teaching on emptiness will never be final. And that's perfectly logical. And Tsongkhapa just didn't want to go there. So now if emptiness is the same for Sutra and Tantra, then where does that superiority of Tantra come? For Tsongkhapa, the superiority of Tantra comes in the form of two things. One is the subjective mind that is being used to realize emptiness in Sutra is very different from the one in Tantra. In Sutra, it's the intellect, it's the rational mind. In Tantra, it's a mind that is based on bliss. So the realization of emptiness has to take place at a subtler level of consciousness, which is informed by the experience of great bliss that has, almost a kind of a sexual in nature. So there is a kind of, because one of the interesting things about Tantra is that Tantra talks about the ability to use your emotions as part of the means for practice. In the Sutra, there's very little techniques that uses emotions. In Tantra, that's a very important part of the techniques. And through the use of emotions, it induces, blissful experiences. And even monastic members, they engage in visualizations which are sexual in nature, with the imagined consort. And that brings the subtlety of the mind, has a blissful in tone, and has to be united with emptiness. So it's the subjective quality of the subjective mind that is being focused on emptiness, as well as the union. Whereas in Sutra, the union of method and wisdom is a complementary factor. One reinforces the other. But in Tantra, the union is in the form of a unity, of a single entity. It's the great bliss mind that is realizing emptiness, and it's total non-dualistically fused with emptiness. So it's basically one instance of an event. So these are the two areas where Tantra really brings its sophistication. So Tantra's superiority lies more in the techniques, the meditative techniques it offers, including using the channels and the drops and all of that, because part of that experience is to take us to a deeper levels of experience and states of consciousness through the process of dissolution. And we kind of guess that, for example, when we, one of the things about the deeper states of consciousness is they are kind of less dualistic. There is less influence of language and concepts, and there is also less influence of self-referential thoughts. Those are the characteristics of a subtle state of consciousness. And this is where Tantra is very, very powerful. So then Tsongkhapa begins to write about it. And from that period, which is around 1410, 1409, he then begins to write in his colophon, refer to himself as Yogi of Guhyasamaja, Sound Tibetan Jinpa. He himself refers to himself as a Yogi of Guhyasamaja. And then next phase of writing was on Chakrasamvara. Chakrasamvara specializes in the teaching on great bliss. Guhyasamaja teaching specializes on the teaching on illusory body, and clear light is taught in both. And in the Chakrasamvara, Tsongkhapa, of course, writes extensively. He starts to refer to himself as Yogi of Chakrasamvara. So it's in these two tantras, and then later Kalachakra as well, that he really starts writing extensively, and including even editing the root tantras themselves and producing clean editions, which are the basis for his own commentary. So he was a meticulous writer, very careful. And in fact, I've been very interested in grammar and orthography. And those of you who know a little bit of Tibetan, we have only one marker for punctuation, which is a stroke. So it's, a lot of Western scholars who are first studying Tibetan, they really freak out because they don't know where to chop the sentence, So, but if you look at Tsongkhapa's writing, he's actually quite systematic in the way in which he writes. He's a very careful writer, very meticulous. If he is commenting on say, for example, Nagarjuna's text or Chandrakriti's text, he would compare different Tibetan translations and make comparative notes, observations, saying, in this particular section, this translation reads better. So he was that detailed, kind of thinker. So, and the Vajrayana, there's, I hope that, when my book comes out, that those who have great admiration for Tsongkhapa's teachings would take some hints from some of my suggestions. There's particularly a beautiful text on Chakrasamvara, completion stage practice. When I was, as part of my writing, I basically read pretty much, not everything, but most of the important things. And this particular text, as well as Tsongkhapa's 5 stages in one sitting, which is the important Guhyasamaja text, there were sections of the text where I sort of started thinking, if I give up everything and do this, I think I could actually get it. These two texts in particular, and this Chakrasamvara text, this is a completion stage text, it's just so powerful. And it's difficult to capture that in English. There is no English translation of this text anyway. But for a Tibetan reader, you know that this person is writing from experience. And to feel that is deeply inspiring. Of course, as a Tibetan, I believe in multiple lives, maybe next life. But at least so I felt, when I was reading those texts, I felt tremendously privileged to be able to have that luxury to write about Tsongkhapa's life And I have, because I'm writing this book, I have an excuse to spend hours and hours. And then, there was a little bit of downside because I was getting so excited. I would share this with my two girls, having dinner. And after a while, they were saying, "No more Tsongkhapa now." And then I was getting, being, living in the West, self-referential thoughts are always there. So I was thinking, now Tsongkhapa is 50-something, he's closer to my age now. So when he passed 60, says, "Oh my goodness, he's past my age now. He's got only 3 years left," which means, do I have only 3 years left? So there were some, my casualties were my family members because I had to try something out, and I got so excited saying, and occasionally I would ring a friend, who would be more patient, but most of the time I would bring, "Did you know?" But I mean, just to be frank, I felt deeply, deeply, inspired, and one of the privileges of translating is, if I don't have to translate, and if I only read in Tibetan, my own thinking is that there is a kind of a natural laziness in all of our mind. So if there is something that I don't fully understand, if I'm reading in Tibetan, I'll just let it go, But if you're translating, you have no excuse. You got to get it. You got to understand it. At least you need to feel you understand it. You may not have understood it, but at least you need to feel you have understood it. So for me, the one of the most kind of, moving aspects of writing this biography was to really take my own personal level of admiration and reverence for this great thinker a notch higher. Really, and that is, if I hadn't done the biography in a modern way, I wouldn't have that privilege. So I really felt, and I hope that I've captured some of this, and I, even after all these years of engaging with Tsongkhapa's writing, I still feel a sense of awe. I feel here is a mind who has shown us a way, and for the Tibetan tradition in particular, one of the strengths that Tsongkhapa has offered us is to really, as much as possible, strive for a coherent worldview. Because a religious tradition can sometimes take the easy way out, say, "Oh, nothing is explainable, it's mystical." That sort of you kind of cocoon it and then insulate it and protect it, and don't expect any challenge. Tsongkhapa is basically pushing the boundaries of human thinking, and as much as possible, never being lazy and content by saying, "Oh, we have reached the limitation of thinking." Of course, in the end, truth has to be experienced. You cannot capture in language. But as far as possible, you have to push the boundaries of thinking, limits of thought, limits of language. And this is where Tsongkhapa is very powerful. He really, for the Tibetans, he really provided a model of the Nalanda Buddhism, where faith and your understanding of the Dharma has to be grounded in a reasoned understanding. And where philosophy, ultimate nature of reality, is taken from Nagarjuna, the language to talk about the experience and description and knowledge is taken from Dharmakirti and Yogacara, particularly meditation language, where the ultimate experience of a path is taken from Vajrayana. And all of this grounded in an orthodox respect for the norms of morality taught in Vinaya. That is Tsongkhapa. And that is why in the monasteries, like someone like His Holiness, can engage with modern science with a sense of confidence, because the sophistication of the worldview in which our understanding of the natural world is grounded is impressive. And this is thanks, of course, there were many other great masters who have contributed, but Tsongkhapa was one of the few who actually provided us an integrated view which really makes sense. And that, for me, is the power of Tsongkhapa. And that is why even His Holiness makes a great fuss about Tsongkhapa. Of course, from a practitioner's point of view, there's all the great admirations of achievement and everything, but purely from a philosophy and worldview point of view, here is a man, here's a master who really represented one of the clearest minds in the entire human history, who addressed fundamental issues of relationship between reason, faith, experience, and meaning. And that, for me, is what, even after having studied philosophy at Cambridge and all the rest, to this day, I'm still enthused by the idea of Tsongkhapa. And, I keep going back. I have memorized some of his text. Even then, every now and then, I keep going back to him. And I hope that in this biography, I've tried to capture part of that enthusiasm, part of that kind of, what's the word, passion. Probably passion is the wrong word to use in the Buddhist context, but but part of that kind of passion, and for me, if nothing else, after this, I could say I could die happily. Thank you. So we can have a little Q&A, and it doesn't have to be directly related to what I said, so please ask. Hi, Robert. How are you? Nice to see you. Yeah.
When does the book come out?
November. Yeah, it's already, I've already done everything. And so I just need to sort of okay the galleys on the 17th of this month. And yeah. Yeah.
In the book, do you have the 18 verse?
The full thing, 18 lines, yeah.
Hi, it's so great to see you, in familiar circumstances. Times I've seen you before, you're in this huge auditorium, a tiny speck on the horizon with thousands and thousands of people, Thanks so much for coming. I had a quick question. My reading of Tsongkhapa is completely inadequate, but I've read in some places like Je Tsongkhapa should be venerated or reverenced as the creator of Lam Rim. Other places I read, no, it's the Indian Mahasiddhi, we should be thinking of Atisha and so forth, Tilopa or whatever. My question is simply, based on your reading, are you able to determine or to interpret, how original Tsongkhapa's contribution was, or how much of it is simply a takeover, from the Indian tradition?
That's a very good question, actually, because if you ask someone like Tsongkhapa, he would say nothing is original, because that was the way in which the Tibetan tradition prized and valued the development of the tradition. So everything has to be attributable to previous masters. You're fleshing out, you're drawing out, but nothing is new. But modern scholars generally agree there's a huge element of originality in Tsongkhapa's contribution. But he cannot be credited with inventing Lam Rim. That's historically not true. There were Lam Rim texts. Atisha's own root text is a kind of a Lam Rim text, the Bodhipada Paradipa, the lamp on path to enlightenment. But they were explicitly entitled Lam Rim text by Kadamba masters before Tsongkhapa. But what Tsongkhapa did, in creating his own Lamrim was to really present a kind of a synthesis of the entire Mahayana path. And this is where his genius comes in. So Lamrim Chemo is a bit like the Theravada classic Visuddhimagga. It's what Tsongkhapa did was, the foundational teachings of Lamrim, they was all taken from the Kadampas. And especially early part of the Lamrim Chemo, which has to do with inspiring the aspirant to take Dharma seriously, commit oneself. All of this is really coming from Kadamba masters, because the early Kadamba masters were very, very dedicated practitioners who constantly, there's one master who said, a Dharma practitioner has only one task, to stand guard at the door of his mind. So there were these powerful teachings which all had to do with capturing in very simple aphoristic style inspirations to urge someone to enter the Dharma, take Dharma seriously. For example, there's one line which says that if you have a space, a gap where even a full person can come through, a gap between your mind and Dharma, your practice is not working. So there are things like this which are very, very vivid, powerful. Tsongkhapa takes all of this inspiration from the early Kadamba masters in the part on impermanence, appreciating the value of human existence, all of this. All of these are really geared towards urging you, This is, cholo kulwa, to urge you. But when it comes to the actual substance, bodhicitta practice, he takes it primarily from Bodhisattva Bhumi and Shantideva, two great classical Indian masters. Tsongkhapa has a whole agenda. He develops it, he integrates them, and he comes up with this explanation that there are two streams of approach. One is the 7-point cause and effect, one is the equalizing and exchange. He integrates them, merges them. All of this is completely new. And then when it comes to, in the Lamrim, the earlier Lamrim text has very, very short sections on emptiness, wisdom and meditation. Tsongkhapa, he develops it completely. And in the meditation section, there's hardly any Nagarjuna or Madhyamaka masters. It's all Yogacara. Because they were the great, meditation teachers and developers of meditation language. So the practice on a shamatha, the 9 stages of mental development, all of these are coming from the Maitreya and Asanga lineage. He develops that. Kamalashila is the only kind of, non-Yogacara important author there. And then on emptiness, no Asanga, no Maitreya. Now it's all Nagarjuna. So this is where Tsongkhapa's genius comes in. He really takes what is the most important contribution of a particular tradition, in Indian tradition, integrates them. That's where his originality. And this is the case in other places. Yeah.
Thank you for coming here to San Francisco. And I want to also thank you for your incredible book on the essential mind training. That is just beautiful and incredible. I don't know if you mentioned that to everyone here, but this is a wonderful collection. And one of the things that I got from that book is certainly my own interest on Atisha. And I was just wondering who really motivated Atisha. I know that he has several masters or several teachers, but who do you think motivated him to continue this tradition in terms of the mind training? Who would be his main teacher who conveyed that?
There is actually a biography of Atisha coming out in the Shambhala series. So yeah, it's actually done. It's probably coming out soon. It's difficult to get a sense because, we have, of course, in the tradition, we have this story of Atisha's relationship with Tse Chen Ling, who was in the Indonesian island, and the relationship, he went all the way there. And in most of Atisha's writings, Tse Chen Ling is really credited with his source of instructions on bodhicitta. The Lojong tradition talks about other two teachers, but the textual evidence, historicity of these other two teachers are much more complicated. And like the Wheel of Sharp Weapons, whether even that is Indian text in origin, it's a little problematic, because if you look at the phraseology and the language itself, it's very Tibetan. So, of course, I'm not going to say that in my intro, because I don't want to be accused of making outrageous suggestions. But the historicity of Tse Chen Ling, I think, is in no doubt, because we also have in Tenguru a text attributed to Tse Chen Ling, which is on Perfection of Wisdom scriptures. So his historicity is not an issue, but it's the other two teachers which is a bit more complicated. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you so much for giving the teachings on Tsongkhapa and his view on emptiness. And I guess one of my questions is that if we take this idea a little bit further, and let's say further, I mean in terms of society. So if I'm really glad that you mentioned Sir Thomas Aquinas, because his view on Christianity and his take on Aristotelian logic actually lay a part of the foundation in the Western legal system. So if we look into the legal system, it's almost very much like a derivation of absolute truth. If we look into any legal document, it's about nouns and entities, and here's how you define a corporation, and here how you define the entities, and here's on the relationship between different entities. So if you were to actually take the view of Tsongkhapa and Nagarjuna and build a legal system around it, what would the legal system be? Because we cannot go into court and say, Your Honor, according to Nagarjuna, fundamental rules of the middle way, Nityamara, Kakarika's, the corporation is devoid of all absolute existence, and therefore my client doesn't owe your client any money in absolute terms. So that would be a problem. And so
True.
So that's why we're thinking that if we were to take this principle that we believe in so strongly to build a legal system, what would this legal system look like, and what is the behavior, and how would you deal with all this kind of philosophical complexities?
Wow, that's a very difficult question you're asking. I think in the I don't know about legal system per se, but there is an understanding that just because everything is empty doesn't mean that you need to slide into total nihilism. So you need to somehow find a way to accord robust reality to cause and effect world. Now, how do you then account what are the norms that you need to accept? And here, the Nagarjunan tradition itself, especially the Indians, they were not particularly interested. What they were interested in is to keep pushing so that we constantly critically become aware of what are the assumptions that we're bringing into our view of the world. And say that, one of the interesting things that Nagarjuna is pointing out, which is sometimes doesn't come through very clearly in the Tibetan tradition or Tibetan writing, is that Nagarjuna is basically saying that give me any concept. He says, I will show you it's thoroughly contingent, composite concept. There is no such thing as a single primitives. Even the idea of fire. We assume fire is a simple reality. The term we use refers to a simple fact in the world. But he says that to understand the concept of fire already presupposes the larger context where you have a notion of a fuel, something burning. So he says, give me any single concept. I will show you it's just thoroughly contingent and composite. So in other words, he's basically suggesting that we constantly be critical of the assumptions that we're bringing into the world. But he's not saying that means that we shouldn't participate in language. So that's why in the Madhyamaka parlance, when they go into this conventional relative domain, they use words like transactional truth or customary truth. And there is a shared understanding that you are participating in. So within that, then of course, there's a beautiful line in a sutra that is cited by Chandrakirti, and it turns out the Theravadins have a version of this, where the Buddha this is a Mahayana sutra which is attributed to the Buddha. Buddha says, it's not me who is disputing with the world, it's the world that is disputing with me. I accept what the world says exists as existent, and I accept what the world says non-existent to be non-existent. So in other words, the teaching has to do with taking the sting out of our grasping and clinging and reification, not demolishing the view of the reality on a relative level that we have. So in some sense, someone like Chandrakirti, or at least Tsongkhapa, would say, there is in fact a line in Chandrakirti. Then Chandrakirti was forced, then says, okay, in your case, then how do you ground conventional reality? And then he says, well, don't ask me, ask the world. He says that our understanding of everyday world is part of a convention that we collectively create, and that already assumes certain norms and rules. You cannot say this thing is both a microphone and not a microphone, because you're contradicting yourself. So there are certain shared basic rules of logic that has to do with rules about coherence, consistency, non-contradiction, identity, and so on. And these are norms that are established by the world. And Chandrakirti is saying, don't ask me, I'm not the one who is making up these rules. He says, ask the world. And that really gives a very interesting clue as to how they were thinking about the conventional truth. They're saying, we are not the ones who are inventing the rules. The rules are already there. So that's how, but I think developing a whole language based on that, I think will be a problematic. Yeah. But it is an interesting question. Yeah. Yes.
I have two questions. Thank you for coming today. The first is, were there any known or recognized incarnations of Lama Tsongkhapa after his parinirvana in 1419?
No.
Okay. And the second question is, I believe in Robert Thurman's Life and Teachings of Lama Tsongkhapa, there's a section which I believe is a visionary account which has kind of a Dzogchen or enigma flavor. The details escape me.
Yeah, I know what you're
perhaps
referring
there's
to.
a emanation of Padmasambhava or something. Could you talk a little bit about that?
No, the emanation of Padmasambhava idea comes a little bit later, actually. It's the second Dalai Lama, Gendun Gyatso, wrote a text which has that line where he identifies Padmasambhava, Atisha, and Tsongkhapa. There's a very famous line called Rinzin Chupe Wanchu Pemachu Nga Yesu Yen Pande Mameze Doji Chango Losan Tabepe Nazo Chupe Karze Kyolati. So this is a prayer where second Dalai Lama identifies Padmasambhava, Atisha, and Tsongkhapa together. So that's, but the Dzogchen, a reference to the Dzogchen teaching is an intriguing one. This happens in the context of Tsongkhapa's important relationship, which I didn't talk about, but there's a whole chapter in the book with a mystic from Lodra called Lodra Namka Gyaltsen. He was a Kadam master, but had some Nyingma background from his family. And he was an abbot of a monastery in a retreat. And Lodra Namka Gyaltsen was known to have visionary encounters of Vajrapani. So all of his teachings are Taknang, pure vision teachings coming from Vajrapani. And Lodra Namka Gyaltsen was way more senior than Tsongkhapa. When they met, already he was 70 years old. So Lodra Namka Gyaltsen sent a letter to Tsongkhapa because he had been urged by Vajrapani to meet with Tsongkhapa because there is an important relationship. So he invited Tsongkhapa. Tsongkhapa, after coming out of the 3-year retreat from Wolka region, the first thing he does is to go and see this mystic in Lodrak, which is in southern Tibet, sort of in the southern side. And he spends there 7 months with this master at his residence, at his retreat. During this period, there's a lot of back and forth. Lora Namga Yeltsin receives teachings from Tsongkhapa. Tsongkhapa receives many of the Lamrim teachings coming from Atisha, from him, actually. This is why in the Lamrim lineage prayer, Namga Yeltsin is mentioned. That was his direct kind of, there was a Khenchen Chogyap Sangpo was one Kadampa master. The other one was Lora Namga Yeltsin. Lora Namga Yeltsin, interestingly, then sends to Tsongkhapa a text which he says that is a response that he received through his visionary experience of Vajrapani in response to questions that Tsongkhapa had asked him about the view of emptiness. And it's called Shulemenjo Duzitawa. It's called Jewel Garland of Medicinal Nectar. This is the text. Now, the interesting thing about this text is that the fact that Tsongkhapa received this is documented because he writes a response to Lora Namga Yeltsin thanking him for the text that he received, the instruction. That's the only thing he says. But the text contains very explicit Dzogchen sounding terminology. It talks about, he doesn't use the word Rigpa, it uses the word Wesel, which is a sort of a new translation terminology. It's not a Nyingma terminology. But the three attributes of Wesel talks about Ngo Kata, that is all there. The nature being purity, the essence being purity, and Ngo Kata, the nature being purity, essence being compassion, and spontaneity. These three attributes of Rigpa, which is in Nyingma terminology, here now the attributes of Wesel, and also the reference to Samanda Bhadra and Samanda Bhadri, which is a very Nyingma terminology, those are there in that text. So now the curious thing is there's nothing in any of Tsongkhapa's writing where he refers to that. He does acknowledge the receipt of that text from Namga Yeltsin. And even Namga Yeltsin himself, to what extent he had been exposed to Dzogchen teachings isn't clear. Because if you look at all of his teachings, they're really direct visionary teachings from Vajrapani. And his earliest exposure to Nyingma was in his childhood through the family connection. So this is one, and in my book, I do address this question. There's a kind of a lacuna, there's a kind of a gap there. Because his relationship with Sakya and Kagyubas are very well documented in the various biographies, in his writings, but there's hardly anything about Nyingma. And my own sense is, at that time, around his time, probably there were no major monastic centers belonging to the Nyingma tradition in the central Tibet that he was active. And second thing is, I don't think Longchenpa's writings were available at the time. And so I do put in a footnote because it's more of a scholarly interest. What this suggests is that we might need to take a look at when was the earliest real appreciation of Longchenpa's writings and their importance for the Nyingma tradition. It's, Jingme Lingpa is 17th century. Is it Jingme Lingpa who made them, brought them out? So that was one interesting thing, but Tsongkhapa himself doesn't seem to have engaged with any major Nyingma masters. That is quite clear. And my sense is, because they were Tsongkhapa, Rendawa, Lojeng Gyabcho, Pelsang, they were all because the three of them were known as the three great masters of Central and Western Tibet, Yuzang, Chuchen, Nambasum. They were all interested in a set of texts that has to do with Nagarjuna, Dharmakirti, Guhya Samaja, and Chakrasamvara and Kalachakra. Rendawa was a critique of Kalachakra, Tsongkhapa's teacher. Rendawa wrote a scathing critique of Kalachakra. He said, and he sent it as an open letter. He wrote in this beautiful verse in poetry, And he said, Kalachakra is like a tree that has been born crooked. He said, it has kind of Buddhist, you can say it's a Buddhist Tantra, but it's so polluted with non-Buddhist elements. Someone could work hard to clean it up, but why do it? He says, why do it? And it really generated a scathing responses from the people around that time. Tsongkhapa, he has a very lengthy lecture on Kalachakra, which was recorded by Khedrubje, that Tsongkhapa gave in Ganden. Tsongkhapa being very polite, he never mentions Rendawa's name, but he actually responds to most of the important questions that Rendawa raised about Kalachakra and explains them away. So it's interesting. So you can see that even though Rendawa and Tsongkhapa were very close, they didn't buy each other's views totally in their entirety. So there was a lot of original thinking going on. And I don't think around that time, none of the major Nyingma thinkers actually participated in that broader discourse. And probably that's why he wasn't exposed. But we do know that, for example, like Golo Tsawa, who was Tsongkhapa's student, the Kagyu master who wrote the Blue Annals, does refer to Longchenpa. So by the end of the 15th century, there was some beginning of an appreciation of Longchenpa. So I think it's a complicated story there. But you're right, there is this text. Yeah. Yeah.
Is there time for a
Well, yeah. Go ahead.
Okay,
Yeah.
sure. Well, thank you very much. Be assured your enthusiasm is contagious. And I look forward to the book. And I appreciate the way in your inquiry you are curious about Tsongkhapa's reading and the role it plays in his breakthrough experiences, the Eureka Moment and so forth. Is he explicit himself about his own reading practice, and does he have a hermeneutical theory, not just about texts, but also about his visualization experiences?
Not really. I mean, they are, for example, like a lot of the dating of Tsongkhapa's writings were done based on intertextual references. So that was one methodology that I've used. And secondly, Khedrubje, who is Tsongkhapa's student, dates some of them. And then the praise to Buddha in praise of dependent origination, that seems to be quite clear that it was written immediately after the experience. But other than that, he does, in the biography, there are direct quotes from him, and which also comes out in, say, for example, Golo Tsawa's writing. There's also another Kagyu master who was a close student of him called Sonam Gyaltsen, and his collected writings turned up. He was actually one of the younger brothers of the Pagdu ruler, and he became a very devoted student of Tsongkhapa, but remained Kagyupa. And so in his writing and in Golo Tsawa's writing, there is a reference to Tsongkhapa giving them the gift of being able to maintain the big picture. That seems to be an important part of Tsongkhapa's approach. Always situate whatever you are studying within a larger context. That seems to be an important hermeneutic principle. The second is never accept an explanation at its face value. You need to strive for your own understanding. That seems to be another important hermeneutic. And these two Kagyu masters actually spelled them out. Say that these two things, both of them say that we learn from Tsongkhapa. So there seems to be certain approach. And the hermeneutic approach that I'm suggesting is really based on why Tsongkhapa chose to cite a particular set of Indian sources as the authority in one context, but in the same text, he totally ignores them in another context. So like in Lamrim Chemo, Asanga, Maitreya, Vasubandhu, they're everywhere when it comes to the shamatha practice. It has to do with yogacara, aspects of the meditative states, description of the role of attention, mindfulness, introspection, all of this. Hardly any quotations from any of the Nagarjunan followers there. The moment he moves on to the wisdom section, which is emptiness, Maitreya, Asanga, Vasubandhu completely disappears. So this is what I mean, that there is a real systematic approach here that he's using, where he has made the decision that certain types of authors should be taken seriously in a specific authority, in a specific domain, not in their entirety. So that seems to be very Tsongkhapa. And he actually wouldn't, in fact, he seems to, one of the important methodological principles for him seems to be not to cite as an authority a text written by someone who has no real authority in a given topic. So to cite Vasubandhu when talking about philosopher of emptiness, for him would be a kind of a category mistake. The philosopher's language it'll be a category mistake. And that seems to be really something very important for him. Yeah, go ahead. She's been waiting, yeah.
I hope this isn't too general a question. I hope this isn't, thank you. I hope this isn't too general a question, but I was really intrigued when you spoke about almost the possibility of going beyond language and expressing something in actual relationship. And I was wondering, I was thinking of possibly a metaphor for that would be dance. And I was wondering if in the Tibetan tradition, if we just pick that up little by little, how to do that, or is there some kind of teaching we can take that's available, possibly, that can help us learn that?
That's a good question. I don't know. That's why I say that Vajrayana is probably one way, because my personal feeling is that in Vajrayana, the languages function in a slightly different way. I think in Vajrayana, probably the language has more of a function like what we understand in poetry. I don't think it's a referential form of language. It's more of an intuitive pointing type of language. So that's probably the Tibetan tradition's attempt to go beyond that rational, kind of referential kind of language mode.
Could there be a form of yoga?
That I don't know. Of course, if you look at the Vajrayana actual practices, like the completion stage, that is very physiological. In fact, in the Sutra tradition, in order to get deeply into emptiness, you have to work it through the mind. In Vajrayana, you work it through the channel, the energies. So I think that there is a body role becomes important.
Thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
So I just thank you very much. It's a wonderful talk. And I was curious about the applicability, the secular applicability of Tsongkhapa's, particularly this balance between innovation and reliance on teachers and past wisdom. And I think in today's world, when we think about it's all innovation and always, I work in the nonprofit sector, and it's always trying to come up with some new thing that will get funded for maybe a year. And then we have to come up with some other new thing and prove how it actually relied on nothing, but our own genius. It's just, so I'm wondering about what it is, how to use this story, right? I find myself quite frustrated in wanting to actually give credit to my teachers, but then I'm actually often told that I'm name dropping and that I should stop. So culturally, this is really difficult here in the United States, right? And so I'm just wondering about sort of how in our day-to-day lives we can sort of start to encourage a balance, or that innovation really is about something that is always interdependent, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
That.
I don't know. It's I mean, in the West always loves new things. That's and also particularly in North America, there's a kind of almost a visceral reaction to the sanctity of tradition. North Americans are kind of, don't like authority, don't like tradition. It's very North American. I don't know if that's true in Europe though, but and that probably has to do with the fact that North America is a very different kind of country and culture. People who came here originally had a certain spirit of innovation, independence, rebelling against authority and all the rest. But I always make the point that it is silly not to tap into the insights and the wisdom that the previous generations and others have all regained. Why reinvent the wheel, and why not utilize? And in fact, this is how historically, human beings have always done. And in fact, if you look at modern academy, if you look at the idea of PhD, now this is my take though, the idea behind PhD is a very interesting one. In one sense, it's an ambitious one, outrageous one, because you expect a total originality from someone. But in another sense, it's a humble one. And the idea is that here is someone who's going to spend 3 years, or in North America it's 5 years, leaving no stones unturned in this tiny, 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 tiny area. The more narrow you are, the more successful you are in your PhD, because the chances of someone not having done any work there is greater. And then you leave no stones unturned. You document the entire process by which you have discovered whatever you have discovered. And then you produce it, the result, and you throw it into this larger pool of body of knowledge, so that future generation, they don't have to do this thing again. They can rely on you. They can trust you because they trust the system that allowed you to pass your PhD and said this research is okay, so the finding can be trusted. So if you expect everything to be innovative, you are completely destroying this whole idea behind PhD, the whole rationale. The whole rationale is that one person can do only so much, and you put it into the pool, and then others will utilize whatever can be culled from that, and then they will do something else with it, or along with it, or build on it. So I often point that out. I said, it just makes no logical sense. It's not even factually true that someone is going to come up with a completely new thing which doesn't take into account and build on the work someone else has done. This is, for example, like right now, I'm involved in this whole area of science of compassion. Scientists like to think, and we had several meetings initially at Stanford, and I was working for CK. One of the things that I said at this very inaugural meeting was, please leave your hubris. Don't pretend that this is a territory no one has went before. I said, you scientists and science is the new kid on the block here. And not to tap into the insights and wisdoms and techniques that others have found before would be foolish. And I mean it. So I think it's, sometimes rhetoric is one thing. And part of this emphasis on, kind of innovation properly is more of a rhetoric, cultural rhetoric than reality. Yeah. There's one, she hasn't asked, so let's ask her, give her, and then maybe after that you will have the final, yeah.
Thank you very much for your teaching. It's always enlightening to listen to you. I just have a very simple question or request, is that if your new book, is your new book published as an ebook? And if it's not, please do so.
Yeah, it will be, yeah. No, this is being done by Shambhala, so they will, because they know that if you don't put it in an ebook, a lot of people don't buy it, so... the commercial interest will dictate them to turn it into ebook. Don't worry, they will turn it into ebook. The last question, yeah.
Hi. So when Professor Thurman came over here and he gave a talk on Lama Tsongkhapa, and he mentioned that when Lama Tsongkhapa entered a strict retreat, he brought a single copy of the Flower Garland Sutra, which is a very popular sutra in Mahayana tradition, especially in Zen meditation. So I'm very curious about is why he picked this particular sutra and what was it so important for him, and why not any other text by Nagarjuna or any other sutra and on any other commentaries?
That's a very good question, actually. It is true. I think, as I said earlier, that the initial part of that 3-year retreat, he really wanted to focus on foundational practices, not Tantra, not advanced practices. And part of that was the Bodhicitta practice. And the Flower Garland Sutra, there's in fact a previous Tibetan teacher, Kadampa teacher, who wrote the Tenrim Chemo, the Tolpupa, not Tolpupa, Tolpa. This master who wrote this massive text on Tenrim, Stages of the Buddha's Path, said that if we Tibetans have not come across Avatamsaka Sutra, we will have no idea what Bodhicitta really is. So in Tibet, there was a real appreciation that the Avatamsaka Sutra, if you really want to have an appreciation of what Bodhicitta is like at the gut level, not just a description, kind of an emotional level, you really need to read Avatamsaka. And that's the reason why Tsongkhapa had Avatamsaka Sutra with him. The portrayal of the Bodhisattvas and their life and the Bodhicitta practice in Avatamsaka is very powerful. It's, because it's done through a narrative, approach. It's much more inspiring than a didactic, Shastra, treatise approach. That was the main reason. And that's true. That's true, yeah.
Okay. Are we done?
Yeah, we're done, yeah.
So, thank you. Now, I don't even think I need a microphone now, but I've got one. So, thank you so much, Jinpa. We so appreciate it. This was amazing. And I'm sure come November, many of us will be hitting Amazon or Shambhala to get that book. In the meantime, we have copies of the Fearless Heart, and Jinpa has kindly offered to sign them. So if anybody would like to get a copy, you can come up. I think it's $18.50 we determined with tax. So right, and we have a credit card machine if you need. So thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to share my kind of passion.